Earlier this month, Fitch Ratings downgraded our federal government's credit rating. But wait, didn't President Biden and Speaker McCarthy resolve the debt ceiling issue? Yes, they did. But they didn't resolve the issue of our gigantic public debt, which, thanks to our polarized politics, just keeps on growing.
The United States came out of our Civil War with a higher debt to GDP ratio than before, and it was almost able to retire the entirety of that debt by the eve of World War I. People with property or wealth tend to also be bondholders, or their interests tend to be aligned with those of the bondholders.
Interesting.
One explanation for how it was Britain was able to run budget surpluses, primary budget surpluses, almost in every year between 1821, when it finally came out of the Napoleonic and French Wars, and 1899, the end of the century, is that...
I'm sorry, let me stop you one moment, please. Britain ran budget surpluses from 1821 to 1899. For what purpose did monarchs start borrowing money?
In almost all cases, in order to fight defensive and offensive wars. City-states, I think Siena in the 14th century borrowed to meet a public health emergency, the Black Death, occasions where monarchs or Republican legislatures in Italian city-states imposed forced loans on their wealthy citizenry.
I love it. Forced loans. Okay.
You will buy these bonds, ensuring that the interest rate the government faces will be lower than otherwise, because there's an additional investor, a big investor, to buy the government's bonds, namely the central bank. I'll give you a couple of additional answers. I see the perplexed look on your face.
Did you know that if U.S. Treasury bonds are bought by a branch of our federal government, say the Social Security Administration, they're not counted as debt held by the public. But if U.S. Treasury bonds are bought by the Federal Reserve, they are counted as debt in the hands of the public. You appreciate how complicated this is.
It's more complicated every minute we talk.
Hey there, News Peelers. Today is August 18th, 2023. And this is Adele, your host at the History Behind News podcast. Aren't you tired of the repetitive news on TV and social media? They just go over the same dramatized developments all day long. Do you ever wonder what happened before our news? I mean, how did we get here? They say if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it. So while others cover the news, I uncover its history. I call this peeling the history behind news, which we accomplish in weekly conversations with distinguished scholars who delve deep into history to give us their fascinating perspectives from our past. I'm committed to making in-depth history that are researched and written by scholars, enjoyable and accessible to everyone. So grab a cup of coffee or your favorite drink or both, and let's get into it. On August 1st, Fitch Ratings downgraded America's credit rating from AAA to AA+, which means that Germany, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, and Denmark now have better credit ratings than we do. Fitch Ratings' stated reason for this month's downgrade is erosion of governance in the US, which makes sense because back in June, we were on the brink of a national default, thanks to our politicians who were playing political chicken with our nation's debt. And if you recall, back in 2011, during another debt ceiling standoff between Congress and the White House, Standard & Poor's downgraded the U.S. government credit rating one notch below the top grade. But does this Fitch Ratings downgrade really matter? Just last week, Greg Ip, the chief economics commentator at the Wall Street Journal, a senior financial reporter whom I've followed and read for many years now, asked the same question and then answered it. Yes, it does matter. The risk has to do with deficits and interest rates. Mr. Ip pointed out that after the downgrade by Standard & Poor's in 2011, bond yields actually declined. But this time, after Fitch Ratings downgrade, bond yields rose. Mr. Ip cites the following data from the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, that the expense of servicing our debt may grow from 1.9% of our GDP last year to 3.7% in 2033. And he further explains that, quote, the U.S. is on track to spend 10% of federal revenue on interest by 2025, compared with just 1% for the average AAA-rated country, unquote. In the detailed caption of this episode, I have dropped a link to Mr. Ip's sobering report, which I encourage you to read. By the way, the CBO also estimates that our debt-to-GDP ratio, which was 98% in 2022, will reach 107% by the year 2031 and 185% by the year 2052. The CBO also estimates that we'll continue to run a federal budget deficit, which it projects will reach 11.1% in the next 30 years. So, given all these reports, opinions, stats, and estimates, we can conclude that public debt is a bad thing, right? Well, not exactly. Let me explain. A few weeks ago, I came across an opinion piece by the editorial board of the New York Times. It's titled, America is Living on Borrowed Money. In it, I read that by 2029, just 6 years from now, our government will spend more on paying interest on our national debt than it will spend on our national defense. But what I found most interesting about this piece is not so much the alarm it raises about our growing debt, rather its explanation that when implemented correctly, national debt can actually be a good thing. The New York Times cited Dr. Barry Eichengreen's 2021 book, which is titled In Defense of Public Debt, for the proposition that borrowing makes sense as a way to mobilize national resources, such as in times of war, in times of a pandemic or another type of natural disaster, and when we want to stimulate our economy, for example, by building useful infrastructure that increase our GDP, which is the denominator of the debt-to-GDP ratio. So, to better understand public debt, its history and its correct uses, I read Dr. Eichengreen's book, In Defense of Public Debt, and invited him to our program. In this conversation, Dr. Eichengreen tells us when government borrowing is started and for what reason. Here's a hint. The prime purpose of government borrowing in the past was war. But from whom did governments in past centuries borrow? I'm talking about kings and in some cases queens. Who did they borrow from? Did people lend to monarchs willingly, or were they forced to lend to them? And what would have happened if these monarchs defaulted, as did King Philip of Spain? And here's another thing. Did a nation's need to borrow precipitate political developments or events, such as revolutions or formation of parliaments and constitutional monarchies? Most of this discussion with Dr. Eichengreen, as you will note, takes place in the historical context of European countries. This is because Europeans borrowed more frequently than countries in Asia and Africa. Naturally, the follow-up question is, why? The answer, once again, has to do with war. Of course, we can hardly talk about national debts without also addressing the role of central banks. Here, things get complicated, but thankfully, we have Dr. Eichengreen to explain it all to us. As we finish our conversation, we get into democracy and debt. Here, Dr. Eichengreen answers the following question. Do democracies demand more debt? The answer is, it depends. Dr. Eichengreen also tells us how our democracy can run a surplus and eventually get a handle on our gigantic and growing public debt. Dr. Eichengreen is the chair and distinguished professor of economics and professor of political science at UC Berkeley, where he has received many teaching awards and is also the recipient of other awards such as the 2010 Schumpeter Prize from the International Schumpeter Society and the 2022 recipient of the Nassim Habib Prize for contributions to science and industry. He was named one of Foreign Policy magazine's 100 leading thinkers in 2011, and he's also a past president of the Economic History Association. Beyond Berkeley, Dr. Eichengreen is a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, which most of us know as NBER. He's also a research fellow of the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. His most recent book is titled In Defense of Public Debt, which we discuss in this episode. He's the author of many other books, including Exorbitant Privilege, The Rise and Fall of the Dollar and the Future of the International Monetary System, a book that we discussed back in Season 2, Episode 12, in the context of the rise and fall of cryptocurrency. To learn more about Dr. Eichengreen, you can visit his academic homepage, the link for which is provided in the detailed caption of this episode. So, stay with me as Dr. Eichengreen and I peel the history behind this news. Dr. Eichengreen, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Let's start with some basics here. What is public debt? Is it different than, say, sovereign debt or national debt?
It's different and it's the same. So,
okay.
When economists and historians talk about sovereign debt, the sovereign, of course, is the king or the highest power. So sovereign debt means debt of the highest level of government. Typically, when we talk today about sovereign debt, we mean the debt of the central government or the national government. And when we talk about public debt, we are aggregating the debts of the central government, the states, municipal governments. And
interesting. Okay. So public debt, the way you describe it then, Dr. Eichengreen, public debt is larger than national debt.
Right. In a federal system where you have different levels of government, that is the case. In some smaller countries, government debt basically is limited. The only entity that borrows is the central government, in which case public debt and sovereign debt collapse into the same thing. But in most countries, there is some borrowing by subnational governments. So there the distinction is important.
I see. 2 points of clarification for me and our audience. One is sovereign debt is different than the phrase sovereign fund, right? Like, let's say they say, I don't know, Russia has 700, million, whatever the number is, in sovereign fund. What's the difference?
So there could be two differences.
Okay.
Again, sovereign refers to the national government or the highest level of government. So there is sovereign debt. There can also be the funds of the sovereign. So the sovereign will have assets as well as liabilities. The Japanese government famously owns a lot of land and other assets. Or you could be referring to sovereign wealth funds, which are these investment funds that governments operate. So the Saudi government, the Norwegian government, governments that are temporarily earning a lot of revenues by exploiting natural resources, want to salt them away for future generations or invest them productively. So they invest them through their sovereign wealth fund. So that may be what you're hearing, what you're referring to.
Yeah. So sovereign wealth fund is something that they stock away and they invest, and it also helps their currency exchanges.
And certainly, I don't know that it has a direct impact on the exchange rate. What has a direct impact on the exchange rate tends to be the fact that they are exporting a lot of oil and gas or whatever, which puts upward pressure on the currency, on the exchange rate. creates what economists call Dutch disease.
Dutch disease. I see.
That comes from the 1960s and 70s when the Dutch discovered a lot of natural gas in the North Sea, and their exchange rate strengthened. Their manufacturing sectors found it hard to compete internationally. Is
that why they call it a disease? Because yeah,
that's why when we see a country that discovers natural resources, is able to export them in large amounts, experiences currency appreciation, and its manufacturing sector tanks, that's undesirable.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
And that's why it's called the Dutch disease.
My second follow-up question is this. You mentioned public debt it consumes not just national debt, but also things such as state, provincial, I suppose, and also city and municipal debts. In your book, In Defense of Public Debt, you mostly talk about national debt, but you also mention these sub-sovereign debts, as you termed it. There's a special challenge with these types of debts. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. So state and local governments have more limited ability to adjust taxes if they have to raise more revenue in order to service debts, because companies and households are footloose. If taxes are high in California, if we raise taxes again, there's the danger of people moving to Arizona or moving to Florida. So state and local governments are more constrained in terms of adjusting the tax base, if you will. And there's a second problem, that because of this, sometimes the central government feels compelled to bail out the states. If one state defaults on its debts, questions then arise about the solvency and the creditworthiness of other states, and you can get
a domino effect,
contagious crisis of confidence, just like you can get in a banking system. When Silicon Valley Bank fails, people begin to wonder about the solvency of First Republic and so forth. You can get those kind of spillovers between state finances as well. So sometimes the central government feels compelled to step in and assume responsibility for the debts of the states, to nationalize them.
I see.
If you will. And that can make what was reasonable sovereign debt balloon into unreasonable or unsustainable sovereign debt.
I learned a lot from two examples that you provided in your book. One was the famous case that was fundamental to our economy. Alexander Hamilton pushed for the federal government, the newly formed federal government, to assume the Revolutionary War debt of all states, even if Massachusetts has more debt than, let's say, Virginia. And there were compromises that were made. Many people know that story. The second thing that I learned is a case in which the federal government actually decided not to bail out states. And I think this was after the Panic of 1837, after Jackson's presidency. Many states, I think Illinois was one of them, I don't recall all of them, just borrowed, and many of them borrowed overseas, especially from Britain, and they defaulted. One of the challenges that I hope you can clarify for me is when a sub-sovereign entity, such as a state, defaults, for foreign lenders, that poses a problem because they can't directly push for them to pay back. I mean, I guess in the old days, they can't send troops, to have them pay back. Could you talk about that a little bit, please?
That's a problem not only when sub-sovereign states borrow, but also when the sovereign itself borrows. So government enjoys sovereign immunity under international law. It can be sued only in its own courts when it extends permission to do so. So
That's bias, isn't it?
There's some funny exceptions to the rule. Hedge fund, a vulture fund, Elliott and Associates, a decade and more ago, tried to get around that problem after Argentina defaulted by seizing one of its naval ships.
In Spain, right?
I think it may have been in Ghana, actually.
Oh, I see.
Who cares? So the general point is that there is no bankruptcy court with enforcement powers for governments that borrow abroad. The main thing that compels governments to come to the negotiate to try to maintain their good credit, to go back to the negotiating table when a bad thing happens, is want to maintain their capital market access. They want to be able to borrow again in the future, so they have to give their creditors a reasonable deal when they run into difficulty. So we're seeing that right now with a wide variety of low-income countries. We've seen Zambia and Chad and Ghana and Sri Lanka engaged in negotiations with their creditors because they're not able to pay at the moment, given COVID and high commodity and energy prices and so forth. But they want to maintain or regain their access to international financial markets
because they want to borrow again.
So they can't be sued, but they can be threatened with lack of capital market access, and that's what makes governments come to the bargaining table and bargain in good faith in most cases.
You're talking about can't be sued. Let's go back to a time where even suing may not have even mattered. You mentioned sovereign funds, sovereign debt, and going back in time, that meant probably kings and emperors' debts. For what purpose did monarchs start borrowing money?
In almost all cases, in order to fight defensive and offensive wars. So all of a sudden, they had to raise more funds than could be conveniently raised by their little army of tax administrators, tax farmers, and the like. They had to pay mercenaries in order to defend their borders and themselves. Or they were engaged in offensive wars. Either way, those were the typical circumstances under which monarchs would borrow. In the modern period, we see borrowing for investment in infrastructure. We see borrowing to meet other emergencies. The Italian city-states, I think Siena in the 14th century, borrowed to meet a public health emergency.
Wow.
The Black Death created expenses and depressed revenues. So that's a precursor to COVID-19.
That's fascinating. I'm told one of the oldest banks in Italy was in Siena when I was touring. I don't know if that's true or not, but go ahead, please. You were going to add an additional point.
But the basic answer to your question is in order to meet military emergencies.
So in your book, examples of monarchs, kings and emperors borrowing goes all the way back to Rome. From whom did they borrow?
They borrowed from wealthy families and from private banks, which often was one and the same. So early banks, as in 13th and 14th century Italy, were privately owned and operated family banks where wealthy members of a family would pool their resources and they would lend to finance trade. They would provide credit to the Champagne fairs, the fairs in the Champagne region in what is now France,
Champagne fairs, okay.
where people would get together and trade. People would arrive there from far distant places in order to trade. Those family owned and operated banks would lend to the King of England or the King of Spain when those monarchs had reason to borrow of the sort I described before. So it's there were occasions where monarchs or Republican legislatures in Italian city-states imposed forced loans on their wealthy citizenry.
I love it. Forced loans, okay.
You will buy these bonds. Was the dictate, but more often than not, it was through the good offices of these private bankers who were very much in the banking business, providing credit for trade, for various forms of investments, and to sovereigns who often had to pay an interest rate premium because of the risk that they might not repay what they borrowed.
This must, you mentioned interest rate premium. This must have been good business because many of these monarchs defaulted. For example, you mentioned Philip II of Spain, whom defaulted, I think, 4 times or something to that effect. And it must have been good business because people still lent to them eventually.
Yeah. So throughout history, we see that risky lending comes with an interest rate premium attached. It's a gamble where the lender is gambling that the extra interest income will compensate him for the risk of default, of non-repayment of not only interest due, but the principal amount as well. And you can see cases in the history where it works out and cases where it doesn't work out, where the Bardi, one of the most famous Italian banking families, is basically bankrupted.
The Lombardi family?
Bardi with a B.
Bardi with a B, yeah. We talked about champagne parties in the Champagne region in France, and we talked about Italy, England. I mentioned Rome. These are all Western nations, countries. We're talking about the Western civilization, quote unquote, I'm using that term, as it was known back then. And in your book, you actually make a point that cases of Eastern civilizations, I'm using that term in quotations again, such as the Ottomans, going back to Persian empires, what have you, like Chinese empires, they did not borrow as much and as frequently. Did I get that point correctly?
You did. So the development of public debt, a market in public debt, is a Europe-centered phenomenon. We see this market develop in Europe really before it develops anywhere else. Attitudes toward indebtedness vary across societies and civilizations, to be sure. But I think the main factor here, and I take this insight from the late great historical sociologist Charles Tilly, who taught at Wisconsin and elsewhere, was that it's really the political geography of Europe, which was divided into literally hundreds of fragmented regional states and city-states, all of which butted up against one another, reflecting in turn Europe's physical geography as a continent divided by river valleys and mountain ranges and so forth. It was hard to unify the continent. The Romans managed to do it for a relatively brief historical period, if you will, but the historical regularity was Europe was divided into hundreds of territorial states and princely kingdoms and so forth, in contrast to, most obviously, China, much of which is a great plain that was unified at a relatively early date, that was able to build a great wall to keep out the Mongol invaders, which didn't have to raise funds, didn't have to borrow in order to fight its neighbors to the same extent as was often the case in Europe. So the story we tell in the book, building on Tilley's work and the work of Jared Diamond, the historical anthropologist, and others, is that Europe's distinctive political, physical geography led to that distinctive political geography, which made Europe a continent of current wars, much more frequent wars than other parts of the world, which in turn created the need to borrow, the demand for loans, which was met by the growth of the infrastructure. The banking families and others needed to supply them.
This is really fascinating. So more wars in Europe led to more borrowing, which in turn created the industry and the skills for borrowing, which we'll come to, and it becomes very useful in later centuries for infrastructure and other works.
I would just observe in passing that there is a large controversial literature about the role of war in European economic development more broadly, how European states were able to harness military technology like cannon and gunpowder that was invented in the East, invented in China, but not really harnessed and applied to the same extent as in Europe, where you had to figure out how to use the gunpowder or you would be
obliterated.
In China, they could take their time in developing the same expertise. So there's a financial story about war and financial development, but there's a broader story about war and economic development that you might or might not buy into.
No, that's really fascinating, which later allowed Europe to somewhat dominate world politics and events, especially in the 19th century. And we'll be back after a short break to talk about democracy and debt. We'll be right back. We can't talk about our national debt without also discussing America's out of control entitlement programs. How out of control? Well, Dr. John Cogan, who's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and also a professor of public policy program at Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, explained it to me this way. Each year, the federal government spends about $700 billion of entitlement assistance on people who are in the upper half of the income distribution. This is an amazing episode with some shocking anecdotes. For example, Dr. Cogan told me that Civil War pension was still being doled out in 2020, just 3 years ago, which was 156 years after the Civil War had ended. The link to my conversation with Dr. Cogan in Season 2, Episode 10 is provided in the detailed caption of this episode. Now, let's get back to our conversation with Dr. Eichengreen. Dr. Eichengreen, reading your book, one could come away concluding that parliaments and republics were formed in response to the need to borrow more money. Maybe this is an exaggeration on my part, but is this assessment way off the mark?
It's one popular interpretation of the emergence of constitutional government, the glorious revolution in England in 1688. That it was really the power of investors that the monarchy required population of willing investors, and their emergence as a political force that led to the appearance of republican parliamentary forms of government, where there were checks and balances limiting arbitrary action by the sovereign, that the sovereign had to concede something, namely limits on his or her sovereign powers in return for continuing to be able to borrow. So that's one strand of a large political science literature on how it was we see the emergence of parliamentary and republican forms of government. But I think one can tell similar stories of the republican governments of the Italian city-states of Genoa, Florence, Venice, and others, even before the case of the Glorious Revolution in England. One can tell similar stories about the emergence of the Estates General, the Republican legislatures of the Low Countries of what we now refer to as the Netherlands. So, as with all things historical, the complete story is undoubtedly more complicated. But for a historian of public debt, this is a significant part of that story.
So we're talking about early Republican forms of government, some of which include parliaments, others a different sort of body of legislature. Were they better able to borrow money? I think I know the answer to that, but there's a reason for that, right?
Boy, is there a large literature disputing the answer to that.
Oh, disputing. Okay.
Indeed, disputing. So there was an early and very influential article by the Nobel Prize winning economic historian Douglas North and political scientist at Stanford, Barry Weingast, that asserted indeed you could see that the purse strings were loosened after the transition to parliamentary government in Britain. After the Glorious Revolution, interest rates came down, and the king was able to borrow more freely at lower interest rates. And then lots of subsequent economic historians revisited their data and conclusions. I think where we come out now is that, yes, there is an effect, but it takes longer to materialize than North and Weingast initially asserted. So they said Glorious Revolution occurs in 1688, form of government in Britain changes, interest rates immediately come down to lower levels, and borrowing for the king becomes easier. 3 decades later, 4 decades later, most people read the evidence of saying it took longer. It took a couple of generations before the effect really materialized, before people were convinced that this change in government and these checks on arbitrary action by the king were durable and credible. So the situation was not transformed overnight, but eventually it was transformed.
2 clarifying follow-up questions, please. When we talk about lower interest rates, that means that investors felt more comfortable lending to these forms of government. In this case, we're talking about Britain in the late 17th century. Is one of the reasons that they felt more comfortable in lending to Britain the fact that there was a parliament, that there were committees that were discussing debt? There was, I don't know, I'm making up this word, more transparency than, let's say, if it was just a king making decisions in his bedchamber about how much to spend? Is that the reason?
Yes. So I think there was more transparency, and there was the fact that the king basically had to have parliamentary assent now in order to borrow. So it's transparency and it's checks and balances.
Kind of limitations. You couldn't just spend so much money where he couldn't pay the original debt back anymore.
But other cases like the Dutch Estates General, it was very much transparency, where they the Estates General, the legislature equivalent, would appoint an inspector general who would publish accounts that would make available lots of more and better information than had been available before on the state's true finances.
It's like now there are people, or at least in this case, a person that with a whip saying, no, you can't spend money on this. This is how much money we have. It's tightly, perhaps not as tightly as today's standards, but it was tightly controlled, the expenditure of money. And that's what made investors or lenders feel a little more comfortable.
More tightly controlled.
More tightly controlled. There you go. Going back in time, going forward actually in time, I want to go back to a phrase that you and I kept on using and distinguish it for what happens in the latter half of the 19th century. We talked about Republican governments. We talked about early in Republican city-states, and we talked about the Republic government of the Netherlands, the Low Countries. These are all Republican forms of government. They're not true democracies. The voting franchise is not widespread. As we move forward in the 19th century and surely in the beginning of the 20th century, everyone starts to vote. I mean, relatively everyone, women, people that don't have property. Did this wreak havoc on the level of debt? Did this cause more demand for public debt?
It certainly complicated the public debt landscape. So in the book, we look at a number of episodes in the 19th century where the extent of the franchise was limited, where only men with property were enfranchised and could vote, as was the case in Britain, even though it had 3 reform acts in the 19th century, which extended the franchise. The franchise was still limited to people with a certain amount of property or a certain amount of wealth. So people with property or wealth tend to also be bondholders, or their interests tend to be aligned with those of the bondholders.
Interesting.
One explanation for how it was Britain was able to run budget surpluses, primary budget surpluses, in every year between 1821, when it finally came out of the Napoleonic and French Wars, and 1899, the end of the century, is that...
I'm sorry, let me stop you one, please. Britain ran budget surpluses from 1821 to 1899?
Primary budget surpluses every year for 8 decades, and it worked down what had been a very, very heavy public debt, because the bondholders, the creditors, the investors dominated the legislature. The United States came out of our Civil War with a higher debt to GDP ratio than before, and it was almost able to retire the entirety of that debt by the eve of World War I. Even though we had universal male white suffrage, even though debtors, the farmers and the populist era were outspoken debtors, even though debtors as well as creditors could vote. So what I'm saying here is that, yes, universal franchise democracy complicates matters, but you can still have fiscal discipline in a democracy. So just this week with a co-author, I looked at cases since 1980 where countries were able to run primary budget surpluses of at least 3% of GDP for at least 5 consecutive years. Something we aspire to in the United States, but fail at.
Of course, yeah.
And democracies are more likely to do that than non-democratic countries, than autocracies. So democracies, when they get their act together, can deal with an inherited debt problem. Not so much when the democracy is polarized, when there are big differences in priorities between left and right, if you will. In that case, there is starve the beast behavior, where taxes are cut to prevent the other party from increasing spending on its preferred programs when the other party comes into power. it's hard to sustain debt consolidation process when you're not going to be in office next year. But when polarization has been low, when government has been relatively stable, democracy and bringing down public debt has gone together.
In the minute we have left of this segment, I wanted to get your input on a development in the 19th century. I'm going back in time, and we're going to talk about surpluses in the next segment as well. Here's my question about the 19th century. Why foreign debt? How did many nations, not just Britain, in the Americas and other areas of the world, started borrowing more, sort of developing their own industry to borrow. But many of them borrowed outside their own sovereign state. I think in your book you give several examples about Argentina and others. Why?
Because there is a lack of domestic savings. There's a big per capita income gap between the leading European powers, Britain, France, Prussia, and the like on the one hand, and newly independent republics in Latin America in the 1820s.
Yeah.
This is the first industrial revolution when Europe takes off and the rest of the world doesn't economically. And second, big differences in financial development that for the reasons we were talking about before, markets and public debt develop first in Europe. So there are deep and liquid financial markets on which newly independent Latin American republics can float bonds in the 1820s, where they don't have bond markets at home yet. It takes them decades and more to develop those markets.
And in many ways, they're still dependent on those global markets to finance their operations at home.
They are. So there's been a push in recent decades to try to develop domestic financial markets in developing countries, middle-income countries, to try to be able to float bonds, place bonds with domestic investors, as opposed to foreign investors. And my view is that that effort has met with mixed success.
Yeah. We'll be back after a short break to talk about central banks. Hey there, news peelers. We're working on a brand new website with many super duper features, including videos of our guests and compilations of our episodes into series, with related blogs that are updated weekly, like series on U.S. politics, economy, health policies, environment, women's rights, and also series on many other countries, like Russia, Ukraine, China, and Brazil, and the British monarchy, and also a series on revolutions and protests, like those in Iran, Israel, and France. So be sure to check it out at historybehindnews.com. See you guys there. Dr. Eichengreen, reading your book, it is obvious that central banks are integral to modern economies, kind of the lenders of last resort. When did central banks, or however you want to call them, going back in history, start to play an important role in public debt?
The answer is at the beginning. Or as long as central banks have existed, they have played a role in the market for public debt. So central banks were created as bankers to the government to provide financial services to the government, to advance the government funds when the government was desperate for money in order to fight a war or whatever, and then to help the government and place bonds with the public. They acted as underwriters, if you will, for public debt. What an underwriter does is advance money to the borrower and then market the bonds. And if it's a private underwriter, take a cut of the revenues in response, in return for providing those services. In the case of central banks, rather than taking a cut of the revenues, they might get other privileges as recompense, like monopoly on issuing currency or something like that. So it has always been the case that central banks act as bankers to the government, and it's still the case to a more limited extent today.
The story of central banks, which you say goes back to the beginning, if you can go back to Italian families that acted as banks, although not central banks, to other nations, and move forward in history. Banks such as Bank of England or the first and second banks of the United States. The funny thing about them is that they were actually private entities. Well, pseudo-private entities, I guess. How did that work? Like, how can you have someone that wants to make a profit help the nation? Isn't there a conflict of interest inherently baked in there?
It's a very complicated relationship. So I would remind you that the Federal Reserve System today has private shareholders.
I'm sorry, say that again. Our Fed has private shareholders?
The Fed today has private shareholders. The member banks hold shares in the Federal Reserve, but what they can vote on and what they can decide is limited. Just like in a private corporation today, you have different classes of shareholders with different voting and control rights. The same is true of the Fed, and was even more true in past cases where central banks were purely private entities, where there was the understanding that the government would take them over if they didn't mainly pursue policies that were in the public interest.
So I see that implicit threat over there, right?
In the background that basically dictated that there were certain understandings about what was in the public interest, and even a private bank that was banker to the government that had monopoly privileges on note issue would not abuse those privileges.
When it comes to central banks, I'm a bit bashful to ask this question. It may sound too silly and too rudimentary, but I'll ask it anyway. Reading your book, this I came across this several times, but it doesn't even have to be your book. You can read the Wall Street Journal today, where the Fed buys bonds floated by the U.S. Treasury, and other central banks, so to speak, do that. They buy their own nation's debt. To a layperson like me, I'm not an economist. Isn't that like taking money out of one pocket and stuffing it into the other pocket? At the end of the day, is the nation's debt. How does that help? How does that grease the wheels?
Well, so it greases the wheels by providing and ensuring that the interest rate the government faces will be lower than otherwise, because there's an additional investor, a big investor, to buy the government's bonds, namely the central bank. I'll give you a couple of additional answers. I see the perplexed look on your face. Technically, the way the Congressional Budget Office and the U.S. Treasury think about this is that if U.S. Treasury bonds are bought by the Social Security Administration or another branch of government, they're not counted as debt held by the public, debt in the hands of the public, because it's just debt that the government issues and the government absorbs, and the two cancel out. However, debt held by the Federal Reserve is counted as debt in the hands of the public. So why we treat these things differently? One answer would be ask the Treasury and the other public accountants
and the CBO.
I think the answer is that when the Fed doesn't always remit profits to the government, so when the Fed earns interest income on the government bonds that it holds, it can turn around and use those profits for different things, like backing for the loans that it provides to banks in need and so forth. I'm not sure that was a terribly clear or convincing answer, but the way this matter is treated in the United States is that the Fed is not regarded as simply another pocket or branch of government from this point of view, but other branches of government, like the Social Security Trust Fund, are. So when Social Security holds government bonds, that debt and those investments basically cancel out. So the debt held by the Social Security Trust Fund, for example, is not debt held by Fannie and Freddie, I think, is not, but debt held by the Fed is counted as debt in the hands of the public. So if you look at the statistics, there are two numbers out there: total debt of the federal government and debt of the federal government held by the public. And
oh, wow.
And the latter includes debt held by the Fed, excludes debt held by entities like the Social Security Administration.
You appreciate how complicated this is.
It's more complicated every minute we talk.
In your book, you warn a lot, quite a bit. There's a lot of different anecdotes, passages that warn about involvement of private banks in public debt. On one of the pages, I forget the context, but I'll read it. It says, relying on the banking system for policy implementation is just a bad thing. Yet here we are, all banks, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, B of A, name them, and I'm sure it's the same in Europe, own U.S. debt. Is there a specific type of debt or a specific type of involvement that your book talks about, or is this just a general sort of blanket statement for everything?
No, it's a statement about holding excessive amounts of public debt and not hedging the interest rate risk. Silicon Valley
yeah, there you go.
Is the paradigmatic case in point, where it experienced basically a fourfold increase in its deposits between 2018 and 2022, and it didn't know where to park all this money. Couldn't find good places to invest it or lend it, so it parked it in treasury bonds. And then, in its wisdom, it took off the interest rate hedges that it had purchased previously. This was a way to goose profits in the short run, and one might think a way to goose CEO pay and bonuses. And then when interest rates rose, it got hammered by losses on this big treasury bond portfolio, unhedged treasury bond portfolio. So I think the answer is, don't require the banks to buy government bonds as a way of making it easy for the government to borrow.
I see.
Attach appropriate risk weights to investments in government bonds. So I was in India 2 weeks ago, and I learned that the risk weights on state government bonds in India are 0, which is contrary to best practice internationally, what everybody says one should do. But this is a way of making it easier for the states to borrow at lower interest rates, and it can come back to bite you if it causes the banks to load up on government bonds because they don't have to put aside capital in order to provide backing against the possible risks.
So going back to your book, in current state of India, as in their financial affairs, if India's public debt, national debt, goes sour, it may just completely demolish the banking system too. Go ahead, please.
So India's overall government debt to GDP ratio, public debt to GDP ratio, is on the order of 90% now, only a little bit below that in the US, people there are not troubled by the fact because India is growing at 6 or 7% a year.
Yeah.
So it's growing the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio much faster than we are able to do.
But if it slows down, then you have an issue, right?
Then you have an issue, and to the extent that this debt is disproportionately held by banks, insurance companies, and pension funds, there are important institutional investors who could quickly find themselves in trouble under those circumstances. So I did a paper on this that was presented a couple of weeks ago with a couple of co-authors in India, and that was our message. Don't be so sanguine about a issue that is treated as a non-problem in the Indian press.
We're representatives of the Indian government sitting there listening to you?
They were. And just because the message is sent doesn't necessarily mean that the message is received.
Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Eichengreen as we get into the perspective.
The History Behind News podcast is available on all your favorite podcast platforms. Of course, we love your reviews and ratings of our podcast, especially on Apple and Spotify. And remember, don't keep us to yourself. Tell a friend about the History Behind News podcast.
Dr. Eichengreen, let's get back to your book, In Defense of Public Debt. So let's make the case for public debt. What are the good uses of public debt?
Well, I think public debt is a critically important resource for meeting emergencies, wars, pandemics, energy crises like Europe experienced in 2022. And in addition, borrowing now in order to invest in productive infrastructure that yields a stream of returns over time, out of which the borrowed money can be paid back, productive infrastructure that boosts the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio, borrowing for purposes of investing in that can be a good thing as well. So when we see countries participating in China's Belt and Road program, the question is always, are these infrastructure investments productive or not? Or to the contrary, are they empty airports, as in the case of Sri Lanka, railways that go from no place to nowhere, as in the case of Kenya? Which infrastructure projects are productive?
And those countries are running into a lot of trouble with China on their servicing their debts. So you talked about meeting emergencies and infrastructure. What you didn't identify in good uses of public debt, and I'm not saying you were excluding, I'm just saying what you identified and what you didn't, is things like Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and a litany of entitlement programs.
Yeah, so I think ongoing expenditures like that have to be paid for by ongoing revenues and borrowing in order to meet them indefinitely into the future is a very serious problem. So I've sounded relatively sanguine about the public debt outlook for the last hour. The book is called In Defense of Public Debt, but I share the worries that other people have voiced. There was editorial last week in the New York Times. There is a column today as we speak in the Financial Times warning that entitlement programs are underfunded and borrowing in order to make transfer payments and meet Social Security payments and Medicare and Medicaid outlays will not be sustainable over the long run. So the solution to that, there's never a simple solution, but it's multifaceted. Number one, I think some of those programs ought to be means tested. Why are we making Social Security payments to millionaires who have plenty of savings on the basis of which they can retire? That's the argument for means testing. And this comment will not make me popular in most circles. The United States is a relatively lightly taxed economy by advanced country standards. And we could use a value-added tax or a billionaire's tax or a wealth tax to boost revenues and pay for those programs as well.
A couple of comments. One, the New York Times editorial board piece that you're referring to, I think even mentions your book, In Defense of Public Debt. That's one. The second thing is everything that you recommended flies in the face of politics, right?
Well, that's the critical issue for public debt management through the ages, that politics can create a bias toward borrowing too much. Politics can make it tempting to put off the day of reckoning and leave the necessary debt consolidation for another day. And the more polarized and fractionalized your politics, the more difficult it is to get your arms around these problems.
And some entitlement programs may make a lot of sense because they appeal to a wider swath of voters, which goes back to a couple of segments ago when we were talking about democracy. May actually create blow to your debt. I don't want to use the term welfare state because that just has so many political sort of meanings. Thank you so much, Dr. Eichengreen. Thank you for educating me and our listeners. And to our listeners, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was fun.
The opinions and statements of our guests are their own. We neither agree nor disagree with them. We're only interested in the perspective they provide through history. At History Behind News, we're honored that our guests share their expertise with us, most of which are based on years of scholarship and research, and we provide links to their projects and publications for your benefit to review them if you wish. Otherwise, we're not affiliated with our guests. We just think they teach us pretty cool history, the history behind our news. Also, unless we explicitly inform you, we're not affiliated with any institutions, including Amazon, for which book links are shared here from time to time for your convenience. Finally, as a reminder, we don't do news here at History Behind News. We peel the news for the history behind it. And our mission is not to provide a complete account and analysis of the past, rather is to highlight some issues and incidents in our history that may poke and prod your discerning minds into seeking some perspective for our news. And if you disagree with our take on history, well then, it means we've succeeded in getting you to think about the history behind news. And of course, share your thoughts with me by leaving your comments on Twitter or sending an email to adele@historybehindnews.com. I love to hear from you. I love to learn from you. Until next time, this is Adele with History Behind News, a history podcast for our news.